Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to begin a new topic in the history of English drama: Comedy of Humours. Comedy of Humours is a distinctive form of Renaissance comedy, particularly associated with the English dramatist Ben Jonson. Now, it is based on the idea that a character's personality and behavior are dominated by one particular humor or ruling tendency. So, if I have to give you an example, so a person might be, excessively ambitious, jealous, boastful, suspicious, or melancholy. In ordinary life, also, we see that people obviously have many different qualities. But in comedy of humor, one particular tendency becomes so dominant and exaggerated that it begins to define the character. And this is where the comedy comes from. So the character behaves according to this exaggerated disposition, creating eccentric actions, misunderstandings, conflicts, and comic situations. But there is something more important here. Comedy of humors, it's not simply about just making the audience laugh. The exaggerated behavior of these characters also allow the dramatist to expose the human follies, weaknesses, social pretensions, and vices. So comedy becomes a form of social criticism. This gives us a very useful formula that we can remember. It has dominant humor, which will lead to dominant temperament, which produces comic behavior. And when this comic behavior is placed within a satirical framework, the audience is not only entertained but also encouraged to recognize the human weaknesses. The writers most strongly associated with this form is Ben Jonson. He is famous for his work Every Man in His Humor, which was published in 1598, and it is regarded as the most important early example of comedy of humors. So, comedy of humors turns exaggerated human disposition into comedy. Now, to understand why the word humor came to have this meaning, we need to go back to the ancient theory of the four humors. The word humor comes from the Latin humor, which means liquid or fluid. In the ancient and medieval medicine, it was believed that the human body contained four important fluids known as four humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So, according to this theory, the balance of these fluids affected not only a person's physical health but also their temperament and behavior. The first was blood. So, a person dominated by blood was associated with the sanguine temperament, someone who is very cheerful, optimistic, energetic, and sociable. The second is phlegm. The phlegmatic person was considered calm and peaceful, but also slow moving and relatively unemotional. The third was yellow bile. Now, this was associated with choleric temperament, a person who was ambitious, aggressive, impatient, and easily angered. And finally, we have black bile, which was associated with melancholic temperament. The melancholic person was thought to be serious, gloomy, introspective, and sometimes excessively preoccupied with particular thought or concern. Now, we should remember that modern medicines does not accept the four humor theory as scientifically valid. It belongs to the history of ancient and medieval medicine. But it became extremely important in literary history because writers could use these traditional temperaments as a way of representing the human personality. And this is exactly what Ben Jonson does. He takes the old theory and transforms it into a dramatic technique in which a character can be dominated by one particular humor or ruling tendency. So the medical theory becomes a literary theory of characterization. And that brings us to the next question. How did Ben Jonson transform the four humor theory in Comedy of Humours? Now, before that, I have placed a picture in front of you, the four humors, the origin of the comedy of humor. So, this is blood, somebody who is cheerful, optimistic, sociable. Now, phlegm, somebody who is calm, slow, and unemotional. The third one is yellow bile, where the person is very ambitious, aggressive, and hot tempered. And the fourth one is black bile, where the person is very serious, gloomy, and melancholy, and also introspective. So now let's talk about from humoral theory to comedy. So you would be wondering, what does an ancient medical theory have to do with comedy? Now this is the connection we need to understand. So according to the old humoral theory, an imbalance or excess of one of the four bodily humors was believed to produce a particular temperament. The important thing to remember is that Ben Jonson did not simply reproduce the old medical theory on the stage. Instead, he transformed the idea of humor into a literary and dramatic technique. In Johnson's comedies, a character is often dominated by one particular characteristic or ruling disposition. Now, that characteristics becomes so strong that it begins to control the character's behavior. For example, a character may be dominated by greed, jealousy, vanity, ambition, suspicion, or some other particular weakness. Now, the important point is that this characteristic is exaggerated. So, the character repeatedly behaves according to this dominant tendency, and that creates a comic situation. But Ben Jonson, his purpose, it goes beyond just simply, making the audience laugh. When we see a character behaving in an exaggerated way, we are also able to recognize something about human nature and society. For example, a miser becomes an exaggerated representation of greed. A vain person exposes the absurdity of vanity. A hypocritical character allows the dramatist to expose the hypocrisy. In this way, comedy of humors becomes closely connected with satire. The audience laugh at the character, but at the same time, the audience is encouraged to recognize and reflect upon the weaknesses that the character represents. So, this is why the comedy of humors is particularly important in the development of satirical Renaissance comedy. And the dramatist we must associate most strongly with this development is Ben Jonson. So his importance it lies in transforming the idea of dominant humor into systematic method of characterization, comic exaggeration, and social criticism. Now, let us look at the characteristics of comedy of humors. We'll begin with dominant humor. Here, humor does not simply mean something that is funny. It refers to a particular tendency or disposition that strongly controls a character's personality and behavior. Imagine a character who is extremely greedy. Now, everyone can be greedy occasionally, but in a comedy of humors, greed becomes so dominant that it seems to control almost everything that the character does. The character thinks about money, he will talk about money, he will make all his decisions because of that money, and he will behave according to his greed. Now, similarly, another character might be dominated by jealousy, ambition, or suspicion for that matter. So, when we say dominant humor, we are asking what particular quality seems to rule this character. A character's particular obsession or disposition becomes central to his behavior. So, that ruling quality becomes the basis of a character's comic behavior. The second is exaggerated characterization. Now, this is closely connected with dominant humor. Now, suppose again a character is very greedy. So, in an ordinary realistic life, a greedy person may sometimes behave generously. But in comedy of humors, the dramatist magnifies his greed. The character's greed becomes so excessive that it starts producing absurd or ridiculous behavior. Now, this is what we mean by exaggerated characterization. The character is not necessarily unrealistic in origin. The basic human quality is recognizable. So, what is exaggerated is the degree to which that quality controls the character. So, remember this distinction. Dominant humor tells us what controls the character, and exaggerated characterization tells us how strongly that quality is presented. And because the quality is exaggerated, it will create a comic situation. For example, an excessively suspicious person may suspect everyone around him, even when there is no real reason for suspicion. So, that repeated behavior can lead to misunderstanding and embarrassing situations. Now, that is where the comedy develops. Okay, and the next characterization that we'll talk about is intense realism. Now, this means that Comedy of humors generally deals with recognizable human beings and familiar situations. We are not necessarily dealing with idealized heroes or magical world or purely romantic adventure. Instead, we see things that belong to the ordinary social life, the relationship, money, jealousy, ambition, social interactions, the personal conflict that we have. So, the important point is that the audience can recognize these behaviors. They may laugh at an exaggerated character, but they will also think, I have seen, similar kind of behavior with somebody. Now, that recognizability, it gives the comedy its realistic quality. So the character may be exaggerated, but the human weaknesses they represent are very real, and it is something that you can recognize. So that is another important distinction that you can keep in mind. Now, next is satire. Comedy of humors is not simply saying, look at this funny person. The dramatist is usually using that funny person to criticize a particular weakness. Now, suppose we have a character who is extremely vain. Now, the audience laughs at that character's ridiculous behavior, but at the same time, the dramatist is making us see the absurdity of excessive vanity. Now, the same thing can happen with greed, hypocrisy, jealousy, or ambition. So, the satire, it means that the comedy, it will expose the ridiculous human weaknesses and social follies. The laughter has a critical purpose over here. We laugh at the character, but we are also being asked to think about the fault that character represents. Next up, we have didactic or corrective purpose. So, didactic simply means instructive or teaching oriented. Now, Comedy of Humors does not merely entertain the audience. By showing the absurdity of the human weaknesses, it can encourage the audience to recognize those weaknesses and to actually make us avoid them. For instance, if excessive greed makes a character ridiculous, the audience may recognize that destructive nature of greed. If vanity makes a person absurd, the audience may understand the dangers of excessive vanity. So, comedy has a kind of corrective function. It is almost like saying, look at this behavior. See how ridiculous it becomes when it is taken in excess. Therefore, the audience laughs, but they will also learn from it. Now, this is why we should remember that comedy of humor has both an entertaining function and also a corrective or moral function. So the next characteristic is social observation. This means that Johnson and other dramatists are not just interested only in individual personalities. They also use individual characters to observe and comment on the society. For example, a character may represent excessive greed. But the dramatist over here, they may be suggesting something larger about a society in which money and material interest have extremely great importance. Similarly, a character obsessed with social status may allow the dramatist to comment on social pretensions and class consciousness. So there are two levels. One is individual level and the second one is social level. Individual level, we see a particular foolish or eccentric character. And in the social level, through that character, we recognize a wider problem in the society. Now, that is what we mean by social observation. Now, the final one is wit. Now, wit, it means clever dialogue and verbal ingenuity strengthen the comic and satirical effect. Wit means it mainly refers to the cleverness and the verbal intelligence. So, wit is primarily concerned with cleverness, particularly in the speech and expressions. But when we see Johnson's comedy, it has both humor characters and witty dialogues. With that, we'll talk about what is the difference between wit and humor. First, let us understand humor. In context of comedy of humors, humor does not simply mean something that makes us laugh. Here, it refers to a dominant disposition or ruling tendency in a character. For example, imagine a character who is extremely greedy. All of us may be greedy at times, but in Comedy of Humors, greed becomes so dominant that it begins to control the character's behavior. The character may constantly think about money. He will make all his decisions because of that money, and he will behave ridiculously because of that greed. So, humor is connected with the character's personality and behavior. Now, let's talk about wit. Wit is different. Wit refers to the cleverness and intelligence, particularly in language and expression. A witty character may make a clever remark. He will give an unexpected response or use wordplays or make a sharp observation. So, if humor is about what dominates the character, wit is about how cleverly the character expresses himself. Let us take another example. Now, suppose there is a character who is dominated by vanity. Vanity means having excessive pride in yourself, especially in your appearance, abilities, achievements, or social status. Now, that vanity is his humor because it controls his behavior. It becomes the dominant or ruling trait of that character. Now, imagine a character who believes that he is extremely intelligent. So, because of that vanity, he constantly wants other people to praise him always. He cannot at all tolerate any criticism. He keeps talking about his achievements all the time. He tries to impress everybody. Even when he is clearly wrong, he refuses to admit it. He may misunderstand any situation because he is too concerned about his own importance. Now, notice what has happened. Vanity has led to control his thinking, and that controlled his behavior, which will create a comic situation. Now, suppose that same character makes a very clever and sharp remark while talking to another character. So, that clever remark it demonstrates his wit. Therefore, the two work together. Humor creates the comic character while wit makes the dialogue more clever and entertaining. And there is one important point that you can keep in mind, that humor it will dominate the character, and wit it will tell you how cleverly the character speaks. So this distinction will help you to understand why Comedy of Humor is primarily a character based form of comedy, while wit it will operate mainly through language and dialogue. Now, let's talk about how will you identify a comedy of humors. Now, there are few simple things that you need to look. For example, the first thing that you should look is the characters. A strongly marked personality trait will dominate a character. Ask yourself, is this character repeatedly controlled by one particular disposition or tendency? For example, a character may be excessively jealous, greedy, vain, suspicious, ambitious, or maybe pretentious. So, the important word here is dominant. Every human being can experience jealousy or greed occasionally, but in Comedy of Humors, one particular tendency becomes so prominent that it almost defines that character. For example, if jealousy influences almost everything a character thinks and does, jealousy is functioning as a character's dominant humor or disposition. Next is the trait is exaggerated and repeatedly shapes the character's action. So the next thing to look is exaggeration. Now, it is not enough for a character to be jealous once or twice. The jealousy may repeatedly influence the character's behavior. For example, an excessive jealous character may become suspicious of even some innocent conversation. He will misunderstand the ordinary situation. He will accuse the people unnecessarily, and constantly he will, worry about being deceived. So get that thing. Dominant trait, repeated behavior. The third is behavior creates comic situation and conflict. So ask yourself, does this exaggerated behavior actually produce the comedy? Now, suppose our jealous character, he misunderstands an innocent meeting and immediately assumes that something suspicion is happening. Now, he creates unnecessarily other characters respond. He will misunderstand the characters. So, this misunderstanding develops and the entire situation becomes ridiculous. So, the comedy is not simply, coming from jokes, it is coming from characters' personality itself. So, that is one of the clearest sign of Comedy of Humors. The character's disposition drives the comic action. Fourth is the comedy exposes human folly, weakness, or social pretension. Now we move beyond laughter. So, why has the dramatist made this character so ridiculously jealous or greedy or vain or pretentious? Because the dramatist wants us to recognize the foolishness of that behavior. If a vain character constantly tries to impress everybody and ends up making himself ridiculous, we will laugh at him. But we are also recognizing the folly of excessive vanity. Similarly, greed can expose more materialism. Vanity can expose self importance. Jealousy can expose irrational suspicion. Pretension can expose false social appearances. So the comedy has a critical purpose over here. Fifth is satire often lies beneath the laughter. And this brings us to the final feature, that is satire. So, comedy of humor does not merely say, look at this funny character. It will say to you that look at the human weakness this character represents. So, we laugh at the character, but beneath that character, there is often criticism of human behavior or society. This is why comedy of humors can be entertaining and corrective at the same time. Now we come to the most important dramatist who is associated with comedy of humors, that is Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson is particularly important because he developed and popularized the form of comedy in which character becomes the major source of comic action. His characters are often dominated by a particular disposition, passion, or eccentricity. Now, this dominant quality influences the way they think, they'll speak, and behave. For example, if character is dominated by vanity, that vanity will control his behavior. Now, he's constantly seeking admiration, boasting about himself, or becoming unable to accept any criticism. So, when this characteristic is exaggerated, it produces a comic situation. So, this is a basic principle that we have already understood: dominant disposition, exaggerated behavior, and comic effect. But Johnson's purpose is not simply to make us laugh over here. He uses these characters to observe and satirize human weaknesses and social behavior. Therefore, this comedy, it combines realism, wit, satire, and moral or corrective purpose. Two plays are particularly important when studying Ben Jonson and Comedy of Humours. The first one is Every Man in His Humour, which was performed in 1598. The second one is Every Man Out of His Humour in 1599. Now, these works are especially important because they demonstrate Johnson's interest in characters whose dominant disposition becomes the basis of comic and satirical action. Now, Ben Jonson is the dramatist most strongly associated with comedy of humors, but he was not the only writer who uses this kind of comic characterization in satire. We have other writers such as George Chapman. His work And Humorous Day's Mirth appeared in 1597, actually before Johnson's Every Man in His Humor. Another important work that you should keep in mind is The Blind Beggar of Alexandria, and the other one is All Fools. So, these are important works by George Chapman, which represents comedy of humor. Next up, we have Thomas Middleton. Thomas Middleton's work is A Trick to Catch the Old Ones from 1605. Another important work is A Chaste Maid in Cheapside. That was very important work that you need to keep in mind, which represents comedy of humors. Next up, we have Philip Massinger. Philip Massinger's A New Way to Pay Old Debts is in 1625. It contains a strong element of exaggerated characterization and social satire. Finally, we have Thomas Shadwell. He is important because he revived the comedy of humor's tradition later in the 17th century. His important work is The Square of Elastia, that was published in 1688. And another work that you can keep in mind is Bury Fair in 1689. So, an important thing that you should remember that Johnson popularized the form, while these later and contemporary dramatists also employed or revived its characterization method. Now, before we wind up, one final distinction I want to make is that the distinction between comedy of humors and comedy of manners. In comedy of humors, the focus is primarily on the individual character, a particular disposition such as jealousy, vanity, greed, or suspicion that will dominate the character and produces comic behavior. In comedy of manner, the focus shifts from the individual to the society. So the dramatist looks at how people behave within a fashionable society, their manners, their relationship, social convention, pretensions, and affection. So remember, comedy of humor is primarily character centered and comedy of manner is primarily society centered. For example, if a dramatist presents an excessive jealous character and makes his jealousy the source of comedy, we are talking about comedy of humor. But if the dramatist presents an entire fashionable society where people are obsessed with reputation, marriage, money, gossip, and social status, and then satirizes those conventions, we are talking about comedy of humor. So that brings us to the end of Comedy of Humors. We have looked at its humoral origin, the four humors, dominant temperament, major characterization, Ben Jonson, his important plays, and other dramatists who are associated with this tradition. I hope this discussion has made the concept of comedy of humors clear and easy for you to remember. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lecture.